Why Yandere Simulator? Why is that the comparison you made?
I was like clenching my ass cheeks hoping that you didn't say this.
You enjoyed Romeo and Juliet more than Hamlet?
Sarah J. Maas fun.
My brain is like racing now.
Oh no, Alex.
Good job, me. I really don't know how to speak.
Oh God! Can't do this. This is my guilty boner. Family listens to these. Never mind.
Don't you me?
You totally believe you.
That's still bigger than a city.
It's more than one planet.
We are going to be talking about historical fiction. Like, Mark, you are a history major, so I figured, historical fiction would be something you'd be really interested in talking in. But, yeah, I guess let's just start getting into it. So to ask the question to you first, Mark, actually, what have you kind of defined historical fiction to be? So, like, I know I gave the definition, but, what have you always thought of historical fiction being?
So yeah, for me, the historical fiction that I've been exposed the most to is actually set drastically beyond that timeline. My favorite stories that I've read have been from primarily the Napoleonic era, and then also series from ancient Rome, and also from the time of Genghis Khan. And so for me, it was always just, historical fiction was this creative interpretation of the past that just brought history to life and drew you right into it, kind of thing.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the best historical fiction authors put you right there in that situation, and you're, in that one moment you can live the history instead of just read about it.
Mm-hmm. So we'll get to some of our favorite historical fiction stories in a bit, actually, but I wanted to ask, since you kind of mentioned it, was it through books that you first started consuming historical fiction, basically?
Oh yeah, very much so. I started reading like classics and stuff, and then I don't even remember how I found my first historical fiction novel, but after I picked up the first one, I read that entire series by that author, and then started finding similar ones to dig into. And
you don't remember what the series is called, or?
The one that got me into it first was the Sharp series by Bernard Cornwell.
I'll look that up right now.
Yeah, they're real good.
Do you want to quickly explain what they are for people who might not know?
Yeah, so they are set in the Napoleonic Wars. Richard Sharp is the main character that you follow through the whole series. He is a British soldier who starts at the bottom of the military, and throughout the series works his way up through promotions and things like that, with conspicuous acts of valor throughout the major battles of those wars. You get into the Spanish campaign. He found a way to bring him over to Trafalgar, which is a naval battle. We hear about Waterloo and things like that. The Indian campaign as well. So, yeah, it's set all throughout that period of warfare, focusing on this one soldier.
Nice. I like the covers. Or at least
right?
the covers that I'm looking at right now, the ones that's just kind of on like old style paper, and it's just text, maybe a weapon, and then just a little bit of a summary on it. Like, when exactly did you like when were you first exposed to these books? Like, do you remember how old you were?
Ooh.
If you don't want to talk about
I would
age,
say...
that's fine, but like...
No, not at all. I'm just
all
trying to remember. I would say 13, 14, in and around there.
Mm-hmm.
It was young. I mean, I've always been terribly fascinated with history, and specifically military history, so those were right up my alley.
Yeah. So it's interesting for you that it was through books, because for me it was through movies.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, so a lot of historical fiction that I knew at the time, it wasn't even really like, I didn't even realize that there was kind of a term for it, which is kind of weird, but I mean, I was like, what, like 6, 7, so it was more like it was all just kind of movies to me. Some of the movies that I remember at the time, so like back before I was 12 at least, were I think The Last Samurai with Tom Cruise. I think at one point I saw Gladiator.
Oh yeah.
And I'll get to that one in a minute, actually. And the one that I kind of remember, not vividly, but it's the one that sticks out in my head a lot, is Saving Private Ryan.
Oh yeah. Oh, that movie.
Yeah. So I remember being so fascinated looking back into the past and like watching these, watching like a very Hollywood-esque movie of a certain time period. I think Saving Private Ryan in general, like that one was very interesting to me because like I grew up watching and really enjoying a lot of war documentaries. So, having characters to invest in, plot arcs that you kind of understand, like for me now at least, like it's interesting looking back into historical fiction. And I guess to pose the question to you quickly, actually, was it through like reading like historical fiction for you that's kind of made you love history and want to pursue it as a major, or like it's certainly like a big influence then?
Absolutely, yeah. I've always, like I said, from a very young age, I was always fascinated by history. I honestly think that was just from the time I could comprehend the information that I was loving history.
Mm-hmm.
The historical fiction made me want to go deeper than just the topical grazing that I had been doing up to that point. It made me want to dig in, learn a bit more about it, and even I was hoping to try writing some of it myself. I thought it was such a brilliant way of portraying history, and I really wanted to take a shot at it.
Yeah, to an extent you could manipulate, you could dictate what happens in history through your own hands, right?
Yeah.
Right, like it doesn't necessarily have to follow what actually happens in history. You can just find a moment and then insert your own characters in it or something.
Yeah,
which personally I've always found interesting. Like, sorry to interrupt, but like I've always found that really, really fun because, it's interesting looking back and like creating your own Nazi stoppers or something.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
With that Bernard Cornwell, one of the things that I loved the most was that at the end of the novel, he would always have a section called Historical Notes, where he would actually identify for you where he deviated from history. So, like, I can't remember which battle it was, but at the end, he straight up tells you, he's like, okay, Sharp fought with the 95th Rifles. There was no such unit. They didn't exist. I completely made that up because I needed Sharp to be here at this time doing this thing, but they never existed. And it was just, it led this sense of accuracy to it, where you're like, okay, cool. Like, I honestly feel like you've done a lot of research, and I could actually trust that a lot of what I've read is closely based on what happened.
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned that, actually, because when I like talking about that, it kind of like my memory kind of jumped back to a book that I read, I think in my second year of university, called HHHH by Laurent Binet. I don't know if that's how you say it, but it's basically a historical fiction book on the assassination of Nazi leader Reinhard Heydrich, I think.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, so that one, and hopefully I'm remembering this correctly, but that book, Binet was talking about, he was recalling everything leading up to the assassination, like the like everything needed like going towards it, but at the same time there were moments where he was stepping back and telling the author, like, okay, so I fabricated this for the sake of, like, for my own interpretation or something, which That's an interesting approach to storytelling in general. But I guess with historical fiction, it probably makes a lot more sense to do it that way.
Yeah,
But
I think it's kind of important for really good historical fiction to identify where you manipulated facts to suit the narrative.
And I guess to pose the question, how much do you personally care when a piece of historical fiction is or isn't accurate?
For me personally, I don't mind authors taking liberties where they need to suit narratives and things like that. Like I've mentioned, I appreciate when the author identifies for you where they've deviated from the actual facts.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, I go into historical fiction with the thought process that this is a work of art, not a work of necessarily academia.
Yeah.
And it's meant to be entertaining. And so there's a lot of suspending of your disbelief that has to happen.
Yeah.
And I'm fine with that. To a degree, there are certain... It's particularly prevalent in movies, where, as we've discussed, they leave the realm of suspending your disbelief and enter the realm of romanticizing and playing up just the one part of the story.
Yeah.
At the expense of the others.
Yeah. That's what I wanted to ask. Or sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's a movie called Passchendaele.
No, I don't think so.
It is not worth watching. It is terrible.
I'll give it a...
And it's one of the very few examples that jump to my mind of Canadian nationalism run rampant in a movie. And there's this one scene where the guy walks into a tent and there's these two Canadian officers discussing their new part of the Battle of Passchendaele. And one of them says, well, of course they're going to send the Canadians in. We're the only unit in this whole place that gets anything done.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and I was furious. Are you kidding me?
That's egregious.
Right?
I guess to put it mildly.
So bad.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was livid. Like, yeah, we had a big part in that war. There's no denying that. It is fact that we had a part in that.
Mm-hmm.
We weren't the only ones fighting. And a comment like that cheapens the death of millions.
Yeah.
And it's so wrong. It's so terrible.
Yeah. I get that. And on top of that, like, I was going to mention that I agree with you. It definitely kind of depends on the story that you're telling when it comes to historical fiction. Like, you could either kind of take it more creatively or you could stick very close to facts. I think with how do I say this? My, I guess, kind of main issue with accuracy is when it tries to really force the two to coincide. And
yeah. And
I don't really have a set example for this. I'm just kind of stating, but if there's one piece, if a story, be it however medium, tries to be very historically accurate while still trying to be creative with its storytelling, there's going to be such an obvious clash that I think would be evident that, not just for historians, but for storytellers in general, that it just makes it conflicting, right? Do you want to suspend your disbelief, as you said, or do you want to portray a very real, a very real scenario? Which, which one do you pick, right? You just lean into one or the other. You have the opportunity to do it. It's just, why don't you?
Yeah, it's a really thin line that you have to toe a lot of the times.
Yeah.
And I think it boils down to, as an author, deciding from the outset how closely you want to stick, like you said, make that decision between, do you want to be laser beam accurate with history, or are you just trying to tell a really fun story within a time period?
Mm-hmm.
And it's a decision that has to be made right off the bat. It drastically affects where you go with the whole story.
Yeah, like, I think the one time period that definitely, kind of finds a decent balance with it is World War II.
Yeah.
And I mean that in the sense that, like, there are plenty pieces of media out there that take World War II in a more creative direction, basically, where, you know, they kind of adhere to some facts here and there, but ultimately it's their own story. Like the Wolfenstein games, for example, it's set in World War II, but it's not exactly World War II, right? Like, it's a World War II where the Nazis won and basically took over the world. That's fine. That's its own historical, fiction piece of story. But when it comes to a movie like Schindler's List, for example, which I know, weird comparison, but with Schindler's List, it really does take the seriousness of that era, and it portrays the danger of associating with anything that was non-Aryan very seriously, right? There were multiple lives at stake, and you knew the impending sense of dread, or you knew the impending consequences through hindsight and through storytelling. So I think the one area that it doesn't necessarily get right, and you've mentioned this earlier, is basically whenever it comes to the US getting involved, specifically the Vietnam War. Like, you already stated it before, but, like, do you have a movie where it's so gung-ho and pro-America that it makes it fun, but then suddenly Americans didn't do that fucking great in the war?
Yeah.
That's
the thing, right? Like, it can be risky too. Like, if someone is only exposed to a certain brand of media in Hollywood, they come out of it with the belief that America did great in the Vietnam War, and they were doing this noble thing. They were fighting commies and this kind of stuff. When in actual fact, it was basically 10 years of murder, straight up unmitigated murder. It really depends on the story you're telling. You have to understand the gravitas of the situation, and like you said, like with something like Schindler's List, there are certain situations where you really don't take liberties and you really don't want to deviate from the truth behind what happened.
Yeah. So then to pose the question, just what makes historical fiction such an interesting genre to talk about and watch, and consume, basically?
I think for a lot of... It's hard to put a finger on it, right? It's like I said before, it's a lot of engagement with history and a lot of feeling like you're there living these drastic and critical moments of history, and I think that's such a huge part of it. And then on the other hand, in a lot of ways, telling the stories of war that people want to hear, the success stories, the romantic stories, the noble parts of war. I think people are drawn to that stuff. It takes war away from being this horrific thing we do to each other and tries to paint it with noble sensibilities that can help us to grasp the concept of war.
Yeah.
And in a lot of times, unfortunately, strays in the direction of almost encouraging it.
Yeah.
Not just accepting it, but being in favor of it. So I think that's the historical fiction that I know. Of course, there's a lot more than just military historical fiction. That's the world I've been the most exposed to.
Yeah.
There's so much more out there that I haven't read or experienced, but from my perspective, that's what historical fiction is kind of used for these days.
Yeah. Definitely do a lot more research. And I guess from my perspective, don't be afraid to ask, like, don't be afraid to like really go in depth with your research either. It kind of just helps build a better picture of it. Or it kind of helps build a better picture of not just the world that you are trying to encapsulate, but also it just help it make it feel more alive, basically. And this is coming from a fantasy writer that is so imperative on making sure that not every little detail, but like enough details help make the world feel real enough, right? It's just different with historical fiction because all of this did at one point happen. So it's, I think, within the author's best interest to not necessarily portray that same thing word for word. Obviously, there's a lot of room for, artistic or like authors' interpretations and whatever, but just understand what you're writing and, write it well, basically.
Yeah, it all comes back to world building,
Mm-hmm.
which is just a fact of story writing for any genre. You're always trying to build a world. And yeah, like you said, with historical fiction, you're grounded in this world and things that happened.
Yeah.
So it's important to understand the way things went in that period.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, like with any other bad world building, it won't feel natural and it won't feel real, and no one's going to want to read it.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, if fantasy writers aren't going to tune into, like, to go off of what Mark said, if fantasy writers aren't going to tune into your world because it feels empty, then odds are historical fiction writers won't want to turn into your story because it doesn't feel alive enough, which is interesting because this at one point happened in history. So I don't know how you would be able to do that. But
blatant ignoring of
yeah, like
how the world worked.
Yeah, like if you're gonna write about the Renaissance, like know about significant changes that happened during it, right? Because at that point you are like part of a timeline. And even if you are going off an alternate timeline, like if you're even going off an alternate timeline, like how they do in the Wolfenstein games, like there's still a lot of significance that you would have to include with your story, right? That, you have to consider in context of, societal roles, this and that, right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, very much.
That's not to that's, definitely don't write in characters that are defying their like place in society, without considering the context of it, because odds are, at the very least it won't work, and at the very worst, oh no, I can't even imagine.
Right.
You'll just stir a debate that was completely unnecessary, buddy.
Yeah, I mean, and if you're writing a story with someone who is defying their societal role, then you'd better understand what their societal role was supposed to be.
Mm-hmm. Like, obviously, when we're considering modern context, things have changed. But if you're writing about a story in the past, do consider that too. But at the same time, that's actually one final point that I wanted to touch on, actually. Even though you were looking back into the past, be sure to be mindful still of context. Like, context is super important when you're looking into historical stories. And, Mark can elaborate on this further, but basically, like, if you're going to be writing like a very, and I know I'm delving into dangerous territory here, but if you're going to be talking about stories that involve, let's say, the N-word, like, make sure you're getting your shit properly.
Yeah. Oh,
like,
God, yeah.
Yeah. Or anything that involves very serious conversation, or very, like, anything that has to deal with very serious discussions like that. If you're going to do it, please do it properly and consider the context in which you're writing it. Like, do not ever just do something for the sake of drawing attention. Like they always say, like they always say, you know, bad press is good press or whatever, but like I think that's bullshit. Just be a decent person.
Very much so.
And
man, in this day and age,
yeah, like be a
bad
decent
press
storyteller.
gets worse.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so The Thief and the Crier, it wasn't necessarily historical, I wouldn't say, but I did try to ground it in history, which became very, very awkward and very uncomfortable for me at one point, because I was trying to segue to a joke about the fall of Roman Catholicism in England,
Mm-hmm.
in which the Crier makes a joke about, well, what do you think is going to happen? You're going to have one divorce and the whole Catholic Church is going to collapse? Which is, of course, what happened.
Yeah. Oh, yikes.
But trying to segue to that point, I had to reference a bad relationship
Yeah.
in the medieval ages. And so I wrote this passage that was uncomfortably patriarchal and misogynistic almost. It was horrible writing it and going back and forth for weeks, trying to decide if I needed it in there, how could I soften it out so it wasn't as bad in the context of the medieval ages,
Mm-hmm.
which were horrifically patriarchal and misogynistic. Is this okay to say? Like, historical fiction can get really, really awkward really, really fast, and you have to make some pretty uncomfortable decisions.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like take the modern context out of it and position yourself within the context of these people. Like, it can obviously be hard to do that, but when like we had already said, when diving into the past like that, you have to be mindful of like what's happened, how these people thought, what's, you know, how did people react to it, right? Like as as I don't want to say taboo, but like as changed as a society as we are now, like we certainly didn't have clean roots, and that's what makes writing about like historical events both fascinating and potentially career ruining at the very least, but kind of life threatening at the very worst.
Yeah, it's easy to misstep, and you got to think. A lot of scenes take a lot of thought to try to portray them properly.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, just be careful out there, everyone, with writing historical fiction. Like, you know, don't be afraid to write about one of your favorite time periods and set your own characters or whatever, but just make sure that you're doing your research and learn from your research, especially because that's what we as a society did after experiencing a lot of hardships, or at least that's what we're trying to do, because under the state of the world that we're in right now, like, history may not be completely repeating itself, but man, it certainly isn't fucking pretty.
Right?
Yeah.
Ugh. Yeah, it's when you're writing it, just I had a good way to put this, and now it's left my head. You know, portray the truth of what happened, but remember that what you're working on is contextualizing and analyzing history to portray that, yes, this was the reality, this was wrong, and think about how we've taken steps away from it and the work that still needs to be done.
Mm-hmm.
That's the power of history.
Yeah.
It shows us where the missteps have been so that we can be better and learn to be better and remember that we've been awful. Just the worst kind of species on the face of this earth.
Mm-hmm.
And we've got a lot of work to do, but you look back, you see those mistakes, and that's the way to move away from it. It's the way to build something better than we had before.